Last week on Wonderfully Weird Living with Pastor Drake Hunter, we asked an odd question. Why would you waste your life doing something great for God? Pastor Drake then offered up the first 2 steps to being successful in doing the impossible for God. I'm your host, John Waters, and this week on Wonderfully Weird Living, Pastor Drake Hunter will continue by offering the final 2 ingredients in the Christian success recipe. Drake Hunter is senior pastor at Elevating Life Church in Fort Morgan, Colorado, founder of the nonprofit 4Dimensional Living, as well as the author of 3 books, including his latest, Wonderfully Weird. Now, this week's edition of Wonderfully Weird Living with Pastor Drake Hunter. We do welcome you back again to Wonderfully Weird Living with Pastor Drake Hunter. And Drake, as we come together this week, we have just celebrated Thanksgiving once again here in the United States. Of course, for many, that looks a little different this year because of the pandemic and such, but what an awesome time to take a few moments and reflect.
Yeah, and be very creative, of course. Well, there's many people that was very creative with this holiday. So let me first and foremost, with this being where it's at, let me say happy Thanksgiving. And, John, I appreciate you so much. It's about an attitude of gratitude, isn't it, this time of year? And it's not one time of year for us. It's who we are as Christians. And that's one of the reasons I love one of the commands of Christ, render to Caesar what is Caesar. And when that's properly understood in the sense of how God was teaching the image of man versus the image of God, actually what's produced with that teaching is gratitude. Rather than mumbling and always griping and whining about things, we render to Caesar, if you will, what is due to Caesar. That's part of our reality. That's what we are to do, and we do that properly. You have this attitude is thankful for what man does in that understanding and that priority. I was in the Air Force for 21 years. And I'm going to tell you right now, I'm so thankful for the taxpayers because we didn't have to use F-16s and F-17s. That's more Navy, but you get the point there. Mm-hmm. So thankful for living in a country and for the freedom. So happy Thanksgiving to everyone. I hope it was wonderful and that you're moving forward and becoming better with Christ through these wonderfully weird commands of Christ.
Absolutely. Well, if you were with us last week, we asked the question, why would you waste your life doing something great for God? And I would certainly encourage you, if you didn't hear last week's program, go and find the podcast. Yes. and listen to it because Drake did a great job of explaining that question. And then you gave the first 2 steps in the recipe, if you will,
yes,
of achieving the impossible for God. And so the question then comes up, why, not only why would you try to do that, but are you doing that? Are you trying to achieve the impossible for God? And let me recap the Bible scripture that we used last week. Matthew 14, verses 22 through 30. I will use the King James Version for this just because of the language that it uses. And it goes this way. And straightway Jesus constrained his disciples to get into a ship and to go before him unto the other side while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up into a mountain apart to pray. And when the evening was come, he was there alone. But the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went unto them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, It is a spirit, and they cried out for fear. But straightway Jesus spoke unto them, saying, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it be thou, bid me come unto thee on the water. And he said, Come. And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. And then verse 30, we'll add that in. But when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried, saying, Lord, save me. Now, Drake, last week, we talked about this story and 4 points that are part of the recipe, if you will, for being a success, achieving the impossible for
right.
God. So if you would, let's start this week by briefly recapping the first two of those that you gave us last week.
When we examine the story, we see those four steps, and we see Peter, of course, being the main character in this narrative. So step number one, as we shared last week, was you got to ask. Peter asked. He stepped up, and Peter replied. And the command, we implied this last week, but let me be very clear here. The command, the teaching of Christ, that wonderfully weird command that this show is all about, that connects with this step, you've got to ask, is you got to ask in faith. And we see that in Matthew 21, and you can go out there and read that, verses 21 and 22. But we have to learn to ask in faith. And we see this with Peter. He heard the lesson of the impossible that Jesus taught to the multitude when he fed the 5,000 plus, and then some, if you will. But now we see Peter in the midst of the storm. He's just not believing. He's now putting action to that belief. And when that happens, that is the formula of faith. And we ask in faith, because you can believe all you want. Belief, really, when you think about it, is theoretical in nature. So you have to do something. You got to put some action with that belief so that your faith then will be revealed. And we see Peter doing that. So again, that command of Christ, as we read in Matthew 21, is asking in faith. And when we do that, John, what happens in our soul then, becoming more like Jesus, what's produced is patience. Versus this, and this is our society, versus being restless, uncomfortable. Isn't that our culture, our society? So many people are restless. And here's the command, the teachings of Christ says, ask in faith, believe, then put that action, and that patience will come in that understanding.
So that was
step one.
The first step, you've got to ask. And step two?
You have to get your eyes off the storm. As we shared last week, we won't go into it. We went in it pretty deep last week. Is the command is hear God's voice. And we know that God's voice comes through that whisper. What whisper is that? Those teachings of Jesus that we get into our working memory, into our heart. And then when we are in the midst of the storm, we hear the voice of Jesus. We hear God's voice that then we can be very attentive to rather than being distracted by the storm. And so that's step number two. You have to get your eyes off the storm, off the circumstances, off the problems, if you will.
By the way, that wonderfully weird command of Christ, hear God's voice, comes from Matthew 11:15.
That's right. Right there. You can go there and you can experience those scriptures and learn how to hear God's voice.
So that's a very brief recap of what we talked about last week. So let's go on now. And step three is one that I think may be one of the hardest, especially for people like me.
Yes.
I like to make sure I have contingency plans in place. And, in case this doesn't work, I can do this. But step three is you've got to get rid of plan B.
Yes, you got to get rid of plan B. I had somebody, John, come up to me after the message the week I preached this, and he's like, wow, I'm trying to grab this because, we're so conditioned to have a plan B. And now we got to understand what this is, because if we misunderstand it, we'll just I'm not talking about blind faith here.
Right.
But I think the best way, I shared this with him, and I'll share it with our audience today, and it clarified everything for him. The way I produced it to this gentleman was, when I got married, I let my wife know that there was no plan B. She's it. And right when I said that, my wife Sherry said, there is no plan B. It's us. We're one. And that clarified it for this gentleman, going, oh, I see what you're saying. Because so often, depending on our roles and responsibility, whatever that might be in your life role, we always have a plan B, don't we? Mm-hmm. And when it comes to those most intimate relationship with God, with others, especially with that most intimate partner like my wife, there's no plan B, God. There's no plan B, Sherry. There's no plan B, church, this is God's calling. I'm here, and I've shared that, and it's quite interesting when you see the history of some churches that pastors that come and go. Well, as you recall, 6 years ago, I prayed. Sherry and I got into this, and we wanted to make sure that our yes was yes, and that our no's were not going to be no's, because when we said yes, when we executed that decision, there's no plan B. This is where God has us. So with that understanding that you got to get rid of your plan B, you have to look at the bigger picture. Because yes, we do need to have contingency plans in the sense of, sometimes things aren't going to go exactly the way we think it is. And you got to have some type of contingency plan and going, okay, God, but you got to be flexible. You got to be spontaneous in that plan, and you cannot be rigid in it. But it's still plan A. And so flexibility, and that is part of God's plan in the overall bigger picture, as we see with the different commands of Christ. Make disciples. Well, you better learn what flexibility is and not resist that, because if you do, you'll be always chasing your own plans. It just doesn't work. So get rid of plan B. Now, John, the command, what command do you think goes with this, John? There's a specific command. There's many that will relate, but with this step 3, you've got to get rid of plan B. What command do you think it is?
Well, I'm guessing you have to, in order to not have a plan B, you really have to narrow your focus down.
Yes, you're there.
To
there you
what
go.
God wants. So I'm guessing it's that wonderfully weird command of choose the narrow way.
Yeah, you've got to choose that narrow way, and that's being decisive, isn't it? And when we think about it, rather than being double-minded, again, every one of these commands is a teaching of Christ, but Jesus is teaching these commands so that there will be some type of result or some type of trait that's going to be produced in us that then becomes a habit. And so when we're focused, laser focus on Jesus, He's our plan, and we're decisive, and then we have to start making choices rather than being double-minded with our different roles and our different all the different responsibilities we have. We choose the narrow road. And if we think about it, how narrow is that road, even in the faith? Because we have to be so confident in Jesus. We have to be so decisive. Yes, we have to evaluate and see what's going on, but it always comes back to Jesus. Never get your eyes off of Jesus, or if you do, like Peter, you're going to sink. But again, it's not how long you're distracted, is how quickly can you get refocused. And whatever you focus on will magnify. That's why we got to keep focused on Jesus. And yes, choose the narrow way, a very familiar teaching or command, if you will, in the Christian faith. But do we truly practice it? Do we put action behind it? And are we actually creating that habit of decisiveness? Or are we double-minded? Something to measure in your own life, people, because we have to have a sound measurement, and that's it, in the sense of that Christ trait that we're after, and getting rid of those bad habits like being double-minded.
Well, and that makes me think, Drake, that, the other side of the narrow way is the wide road where it's easy. And so in that particular case, if we're not choosing the narrow way, then we're saying, well, if God doesn't do it the way I want it done,
that's right,
then I'll go ahead and do it my way and expect God to bless it then. And God's going, no, here's the plan. Here, do it this way.
Now, going back to the boat where Peter was where this experience happened, the broad road, of course, is the 11 sitting in the boat not doing anything. That's the broad way. That's passive. But Peter, the one, decided to stand up, and truly, he chose the narrow way. I'm going to do the impossible. I got to trust in God. Good night. If you don't think it's impossible to walk on water, you're not understanding what we're saying here, because it is impossible. And as I shared in the message when I preached it, I said, well, if you don't think this is impossible, I encourage you to go out to Lake Jackson here in Morgan County, Colorado, in the summer. I'm not talking about ice here, and try to walk across the middle of the lake. You ain't going to do it. It's impossible. And that's the whole lesson. We see Peter, a broken person like you and I, John. He was a human being. I know we idolize some of these people, but he was a broken person just like you and I, and he decided to get his eyes on Jesus and to be focused and to choose that narrow way. And that's exactly what we see in this narrative and what he's doing. So step number 3 is you've got to get rid of plan B. There is no other faith. There is nothing else out there, and choose the narrow way. Of course, that narrow way being Jesus. And boy, could we go in so many directions with how that actually is set up and how you experience that narrow road, because there's some just beautiful phases, if you will, if I can put it that way, through the way, and you gain the blessings and the rewards of all of that. And when you understand that, you truly understand faith and hope and love and how to live in that abundant living. Another message, another time.
So the wonderfully weird command of Christ, choose the narrow way, comes from Matthew 7, verses 7 and 8.
Yes.
So that leads us now to step 4. So step 1, you've got to ask.
Yes.
Step 2, you have to get your eyes off the storm. Step 3, you've got to get rid of plan B. And now, all of that put in place, there's still one huge step, and that is you got to get out of the boat.
You've got to get out of the boat.
We can make plans all day long, but until we execute the plans.
That's right. We got to get out. Let me say this. The boat in this narrative is the plan B.
Sure.
And if we catch that, we'll understand that, because it's step 3, you've got to get rid of plan B. Well, for most people, the boat is plan B. Yeah, again, going back to if I was in the boat, come a little closer, Jesus, if you will, because just in case if I do step out and things just don't work out, then I can still have enough space that I can grab the boat again. So plan B is the boat, but now what we have to do is truly step out of that plan that we have and truly step out of the boat and truly get our eyes on Jesus so that we can accomplish the impossible. Not do great things for Jesus, not even do good things for God, but do the impossible. And again, as we shared last week, the impossible is perhaps mending broken relationships with God and with others, with your spouse, with kids, whatever that is. That is the impossible. We have to reconcile. We have to get the movement of Christ, this movement we're talking about at Elevating Life Church in Morgan County. It seems so impossible. But, as you know, John, we step out of the boat and we do some, it seems like crazy things, and people are going to mock you. People are going to, gossip and slander, not only you as an individual, but you as a group of people going back to the boat again. Sit down, Peter, you're crazy. What are you doing? Why are you doing this through the pandemic? Why are you doing this during the most craziest time of, some people are saying, in the history of mankind? Well, we're going to step out of the boat. Mm-hmm. And are we scared? Of course, we're terrified. However, we don't let the fear of man dictate anything for us. We're going to sit down. We're going to evaluate. We're going to pray. We're going to put a plan together based on the commands, these wonderfully weird commands of Christ. And we're going to step out of the boat, and we're going to put that command, that wonderfully weird command of Christ known as fear not, into practice. Now, fear not comes right after that command of right before hearing God's voice. The command, systematically speaking, is you've got, be as wise as serpent. That next command in sequence is fear not. And fear not of man. Don't be a people pleaser. Don't follow the tradition of man's teachings or the relationships that you might have or not have or whatever. But fear not means to turn towards Jesus and put all of your faith on Him. Mm-hmm. And the only fear we should have is fearing that we are not actually focused on Jesus and we're doing plan B and we're doing it our way. We should be scared to death of that. But that's the problem, isn't it? Not that we want to focus there, but the problem is, people, are you truly focused on Jesus? Are you allowing the fear of the storm and the circumstances and everything, whatever situation you're going through, knock you out? keeping you seated in the boat, if you will. Again, we're here to encourage and to challenge, because we have to understand it's the fear that's keeping most Christians sitting in the boat and not doing the impossible with their own lives, with the church. Many churches, it seems like it's impossible. We're going to come out of this. Well, that's the voice of God saying, come together with me and with others and achieve the impossible, because I'm here. I'm here to fix your problems.
Well, and I would say, Drake, that what you just talked about is a huge reason why we see so many churches closing and not being able to survive over the last 10, 20 years.
That's right.
And it seems like every day we hear stories about tens or hundreds of churches that are closing their doors, and you wonder why. And I think you just hit on it right here.
Yeah, well, it's the fear of not having enough people. It's the fear of not having enough money. It's the fear of not having enough, let's say, influence. We can go on and on with that. And the thing is, we have our eyes on the world's understanding, don't we? If we don't have enough wealth, well, we're not going to make it. If we don't have enough power, in the sense of society and culture and influence, we're not going to make it. If we're not popular in our community, and if we're not a big enough church or whatever, we're going to sink. Social status, that's another one. So many churches and so many people, Christians, are attempting to get themselves in a certain social status. Well, we're not after social status. We're after unity. We're after harmony, coming together and being one, not only as a local church, but as a universal church as well, where we come together. That should be our focus. Jesus is unity. Jesus isn't a social status or a position. Good night. He's Jesus. He's our Lord and Savior. He's our template, and that's exactly what we should be focused on, rather than those other areas that many churches they get lost in the numbers and what the expectations is, and then they get fearful because they can't pay their bills and all this other stuff. Well, part of that is because your eyes are focused on the wrong people, the wrong things, and
Focused on the storm.
They're focused on everything but Jesus. Well, and let me encourage you to step out of the boat as Peter did, so that you can achieve the impossible, because it's only God that's going to get you out of this mess. It's going to get everyone out of this mess. And by the way, so many people, I had a conversation this morning with someone, but they're like, I said, I made the comment, I said, God is in control. It's not the power of the storm that controls me. It's the power of God. And they came back and they said, well, I understand that, and they took that as blind faith, and that's not how I meant it. But at the same time, they came back and they were very condescending to me with their comments. And I'm like, what don't you understand about that? Well, it's too broad. Well, yeah, I'm talking about the universal reality of God here. But at the same time, let's make it personal. Keep your eyes on Jesus. Get these commands in your heart, and fear not. And I don't know if we mentioned that. That's Matthew chapter 10, verse 28. And there's a narrative, of course, there. But that's where you can go, where Jesus is teaching about fear and how to really step up and have courage. And so there you have it. Step 4, right? You've got to get out of the boat. And to do that, you're going to have to manage the fear. Actually, you're going to have to understand where your loyalty is. Is it the fear of man or fear of God? Well, of course, here Jesus is speaking, fear not of man, and what all that is. Because what happens typically there is, if you fear man, you will face the consequences of man. But if you fear God, you'll receive the blessings and the rewards of that, and you will achieve the impossible, again, which is the success for a Christian. Nothing else, nothing more. We've got to achieve the impossible. And we do it individually, of course, but then we do it collectively, and the world will witness that, and they will see Jesus, and they'll be drawn to us, and then we can tell them about Jesus. We can reach the lost, and we can create this movement throughout the entire world and multiply that so that the world is truly being saved. Through Jesus, of course.
Absolutely. Well, in a time that we live in right now, Drake, with the pandemic and with the uncertainty of our political scope right now and all that kind of thing, what a timely reminder over these last 2 weeks of what we should be focusing on and what success truly is.
Yes, no matter the circumstance, situation. And let me say this, good or bad, because sometimes the goodness, John, can be just as bad as the storm, because oftentimes when we are successful, we do great things, we get locked into that, and then that becomes a problem in itself as well. So we're focused on the storms, but at the same time, we've got to understand sometimes we get focused on the greatness and the goodness of what we're doing, and we lose sight of Jesus as well. So we have to be very intentional here as we seek God's kingdom together.
So the 4 steps, the 4 parts of this recipe, if you will, of achieving the impossible. Step 1, you've got to ask, and that's ask in faith. Step 2, you have to get your eyes off the storm, and that's that wonderfully weird command, hear God's voice. Step 3, you've got to get rid of plan B, and that is the command, choose the narrow way. And then step 4, you've got to get out of the boat, and that's the command, fear not. And Drake, we have just a moment left, but you said something yesterday to me that I thought was absolutely brilliant. I hadn't thought of it this way, but it's with the commands of Christ, by knowing them and having them in your heart, then when a situation arises, you can do just like you did here and put together the proper recipe.
That's right.
To be able to confront that issue.
Yeah, that's why it's important to know the basic commands of Christ, because then as you mature, just like you would with anything else, you start putting those those teachings together, and you start really making different experiences and resolving things in a way that you've never done before, because you have the proper ingredients to really develop or cook, however you want to, whatever metaphor you want to use, and resolve problems in the way Christ would, and being focused in our faith.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hopefully these 2 programs here, part 1 and part 2, have been uplifting and informing for you out there. And we certainly encourage you to continue listening to the program here each week, and subscribe to the podcast. You
Yes.
can listen to it, and get out there. And if you don't belong to a Bible-believing church, please go get involved in a Bible-believing church. That is first and foremost, because we're called to be part of a community.
Amen.
That's it for this week. We'll see you again next week on Wonderfully Weird Living with Pastor Drake. Thank you for joining us once again this week. If you would like to learn more or have any questions or comments, please feel free to email Pastor Drake at wonderfullyweirdliving@gmail.com. To obtain your own copy of the book Wonderfully Weird, please log on to www.wonderfullyweirdliving.com and click on the button that says Buy the Book. Now, for Pastor Drake Hunter, I'm John Waters, wishing you a wonderfully weird week and a happy Thanksgiving.